world of watches, there are only a few select pieces that can be truly called icons. But every so often there's a watch that just comes along which is so bold and revolutionary and daring and different that it just rewrites the entire rulebook. Now, most commonly in the watch industry, change happens in small incremental steps that are so subtle you don't really see them happening. But that's what separates the average watch from the icons. It's not about being the best or the most complicated, it's about impact. Iconic watches are not just watches that add complications for the sake of it, they invent a brand new technology, change an entire way of thinking or an approach which changes everything that comes after it. So in this video, we're going to dive into what actually makes a watch iconic. What are the most iconic watches out there? And also, if you're on a budget, what are the iconic watches that you can buy without breaking the bank? And so our journey begins in 1950s when having a dive watch available for the general public wasn't really a thing. And then along came the Rolex Submariner. The Submariner wasn't just a dive watch. It was a masterclass in functional design. A rotating timing bezel, a high contrast black dial with illuminated markers, and a robust water-resistant case. And these weren't just new features added to a watch for fun, it was a revolutionary way of thinking. And that one bold move changed the entire industry forever, as dive watches are some of the most popular models sold for pretty much every single brand out there. You see, before the Submariner, watches were mostly used as decoration, like as jewelry, right? But now they were starting to be seen as tools to explore, to adventure, to be worn every day. Ultimately, the dive watch started to become this universal symbol for capability. And the reason that Rolex is such an iconic brand is because they didn't just do that with the Submariner, they've done it multiple times. For example, they used the exact same problem-solving approach during the golden age of air travel. Pan Am pilots needed a watch that could track multiple time zones at the same time. And the result was the Rolex GMT Master. By adding a fourth hand and a bi-colored 24-hour rotating bezel, Rolex created a simple but innovative solution. The reason the Pepsi bezel is so popular is not because of just how it looks. The distinctive red and blue sections gave the pilots an instant idea of whether it was night or day at home. And much like the Submariner, the GMT became the benchmark within its category. It established a design language and almost like a rule book that pretty much every single other brand follows to this day, and very successfully so. Now on Christmas Day, 1969, the entire watch industry world was turned upside down. Seiko released a watch called the Astron, which was the first commercially available quartz wristwatch. Now this was a revolution. Suddenly there was this battery-powered watch which could not only keep time more accurately than a mechanical watch, but it was also far more cost-effective to make. And this wasn't the best news for brands that focused on making mechanical watches. However, the evolution did not stop there, because in 1981, a Casio engineer named Kikuo basically dropped a mechanical watch on the floor, shattering it everywhere. It was a watch that his father gave him beforehand, and this sparked an idea. What if you could create a watch that was indestructible? And then after developing over 200 prototypes and dropping them all from a third-story window to test them, in 1983, Kikuo and his team ended up creating what we know today as the G-Shock. And as we all know, the rest is kind of history. The G-Shock went on to become a huge commercial success, which kind of piggybacked on the back of the Quartz crisis, but made the best of a moment in time where Kikuo and his team really grabbed the opportunity and created a product which was incredibly iconic at the time and still to this day. So all these mechanical watchmakers were kind of looking at this incredible quartz movement that was happening, and in kind of a stroke of genius, to be honest, they didn't fight it, they actually embraced it and ended up creating the Swatch Group, which, if you know what Swatch means, it basically means second watch, meaning that, you know, a mechanical watch should be your first watch, but then you can have other watches as well at more accessible price points. Therefore, more revenue for the mechanical watchmakers, because they ultimately, at that point, pretty much owned everything. The Swatch Group was essentially creating the perfect gateway drug into the world of horology, right? I still remember my first ever G-Shock. It was like a yellow thing. It was, I don't even know where it is, to be honest. It's probably back at home in England. And I love that watch. I loved it to pieces, right? Like, it's probably still taken away in a cupboard in my mum's basement or something somewhere. But those were the watches that kind of got you into watches. And then, you know, fast forward 10 years later, you know, you're in a Rolex AD crying because they won't give you a date just. Now, rewinding back to the 1970s, if we thought about, what a luxury watch was, it was a little round watch made of gold. That was basically what a luxury watch was seen to be. And Audemars Piguet were struggling, to be completely honest. They were not making ends meet, and they were on the cusp of going out of business until they turned to a very special designer named Gerald Genta. Now, as the legend has it, Monsieur Genta basically sketched a watch in the evening for AP that eventually became the Royal Oak, inspired by a diver's helmet with an integrated bracelet and kind of this very unique look which hadn't really been seen in the world of watches before. But there was also one key thing that was very different about the Royal Oak, which had never been seen before in the world of watches. Because remember, at the time, a luxury watch was meant to be solid gold. A little solid gold thing on your wrist, which, showcased that you had a little bit of pizzazz, I suppose. This was not the case for the Royal Oak. The Royal Oak was going to be made of steel, which was completely preposterous for back in the day, right? In the 1970s, if you were walking around with a steel watch, saying that it was a luxury watch and it was priced as a luxury watch when you could actually buy a car for pretty much the same price, it raised a few eyebrows. And to be honest with you, when it first came out into the market, people were kind of confused and also kind of bad-mouthing it. They kind of joked about the watch when it first came into the market. But over time, people started to buy it, and it was a huge commercial success. It cemented Gerald Genta as this iconic watch designer. He went on to design more iconic watches as well later on in his career, but most importantly, it created an entire new category of luxury steel sports watches. However, that's where people think the luxury steel watch story started, when it didn't. It started in 1904, a time when the famous aviator Alberto Santos Dumont complained to his friend Louis Cartier that he needed a way to check the time when flying without fumbling around for his pocket watch. And his friend Cartier, being the incredible friend that he is, devised a solution: a flat, square-cased watch with a screw-down bezel worn on a leather strap. And there was born the Cartier Santos, arguably the first ever purpose-built luxury steel watch. However, it's important to mention that it was originally designed for the purpose of the pilot actually using it whilst flying and making sure that he can keep time accurately without fumbling around for his pocket watch. However, as the Cartier company grew and became a luxury brand, that ultimately became the luxury sports watch that it deserved to be. So I guess being an iconic watch requires a little bit of history or a little bit of a story to kind of add some substance to the actual design. And those two watches, the Royal Oak and the Cartier Santos, have that in abundance. Because people don't like the Royal Oak or the Cartier just because how it looks, because there's plenty of other options out there that look exactly the same. They like them because of the moment in time that those two pieces and the ideas and the concepts that develop those pieces represent. Now, when we talk about the iconic watches that are out there, there are obviously some names that pop up like the Royal Oak, the Cartier Santos and the Rolex Submariner, but there are also some other names and some other players out there that we just can't ignore. Citizen, for example, deserves huge credit for their Citizen Eco Drive technology. It literally harnesses the power of light to allow you to never have to change the battery and never have to worry about, not winding it in the morning before you head off to work. It is, or was, a revolution back in the day when it first got introduced into the market. And, in terms of being iconic, yes, it doesn't cost $23,000 like a Royal Oak, but it's still a very important watch, and it still changed a lot of things going forward. And finally, most of the watches that we've actually discussed so far have been sports watches, but one watch that doesn't get the recognition that it deserves, and it actually has a little bit of a bad rep because it's the watch that you get offered before you actually get a Nautilus or an Aquanaut, is the Calatrava from Patek Philippe. Now, the Calatrava was introduced in the 1930s, and it was one of the first watches ever to really kind of define that design language for a formal, beautiful dress watch. It was so simple, with a nice round case and elegant integrated lugs. It created a distinctive shape of a classic dress watch that has beauty but also restraint and also perfect proportions. And the Calatrava deserves so much more appreciation, I think, because it was so ahead of its time. Back in the 1930s, it literally defined the design DNA and the overall look and feel that we still see as being extremely prevalent in a lot of dress watches that we see in the modern day. And it's not that any of them were trying to be significantly different, but They were more so trying to solve a problem. They were trying to do something new. And I think that's what they all have in common. They all were first at something. They all did something first. And they changed how things were done so that they were altered into how they could be done. And I think that takes a lot of bravery. That takes a lot of kahunas. That takes a lot of risk. It's very daring, but it's also extremely necessary, because imagine if none of those brands had taken that leap. Maybe no one would have. So I'm just thankful that those brands, and also brands right now, are taking leaps like that to try and revolutionize and push the watch world forward. Which watch out there today in the market right now is slowly but surely becoming the icon of the next 50 to 70 years. What do you think? I think maybe not, but Cubitus, you don't know if I'm joking, do you? Don't knock it till you've tried it. Try it on. Anyway, I'll see you in the next video.